Hello everyone, welcome back to Introducing the Creative Industries. This week we are going to talk about Chinese cities. So by the sound of the title, I think you already know that we're going to mention not just the CCI policies on the national level or regional level, but also down to the local levels. And I saved China, the PRC, kind of like the last cases that we are going to speak about in the final few talks about, Asian countries and now cities. It's truly because how complex it is. It is a case that has almost everything. It has, the kind of like the differences in terms of the central and local governance. And also it has its own kind of neoliberal agenda, why that it is an authoritarian regime. So I hope that you're going to feel that you'll be able to learn something from it and then also enjoy the discussion that we have later. So let's get started. So in the lecture today, first of all, that we're going to have a little chat about the assignment and then about the marking. And I know that a lot of you have already been preparing it, and then also we'll save some time later today for the questions that if you have any. And then the second part that will come to the creative industries in China. I'll give a little bit of introductions about the overall development, and then we'll move on to break down to the case studies of 3 cities. These 3 cities will include Beijing, Harbin, and then also Guangzhou. Then we'll move on to speak about creative cluster, which is Shanghai, which is in Shanghai called M50. I think that maybe some of you have already been there, and then I'm looking forward to share some of your thoughts with you in a discussion later that we'll have it back on live today. And actually, that later on that I will also move on to the overall kind of like critique, and then I will share with you how some of the other scholars have been, writing and then have been analyzing the policies in China today, so that we'll kind of bring this discussion all back to the national level and how that China interacts with the international societies again. So that's gonna be quite a lot, and we're gonna start with the discussion of the second assignment. I think I've been sort of like repeating the titles for quite a few times already. So please choose one of the essay questions to answer. You don't have to answer all of it. And I actually had got questions from some of you that you really want to choose like 2 of them. That is fine, but just I'll recommend you to be sure to ensure that there is still certain level of depth into each of the questions that you would like to answer. So that's the question. And then also I would like to share with you how I'm going to mark those assignments, because when I mark your assignment, it's really breaking down to the criteria. And for the final final assessment the due date was wrong. Please correct it. Like it's the 20th. Okay, we've already covered that. And then the original, I meant that the marking of the final assignment, because it counts as 45% of your final mark. And it will be break down to kind of like 3 criteria. The first one is originality and relevance. The second one would be quality. And to assess the quality of your work, I will look at the structure, the arguments, and the references. So please be sure that the references are provided. I think that's actually something that is relatively easy to make sure that you get, good enough grade. And then also state of completion and clarity would be another thing that I look at. So please feel free to ask questions later if you have any of it, but I will be marking your essays according to those criteria. And then let's take a look at China, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, from here. So as we kind of cover about Thailand, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, we knew that with this wave of neoliberalism in the contemporary thinking and also political movement, that we know that neoliberalism might be one aspect of CCI policies in many countries. In fact, for the UK, it started with almost the same time with the wave of neoliberal development as well in terms of the political climate. So neoliberalism usually stands for, driving the policies towards increasing the economic growth rather than having such as social welfare, such as having the enterprises to pay tax or more tax. And so those agendas would usually be implemented by the slightly more right-wing governments in the economic sense. But anyway, since that is the trend in many of the countries, that is something that these countries might have in common in terms of the foundation of those policies. But China is a bit different. Why China sharing certain neoliberal discourse, especially after 改革开放? It is still a state with authoritarian control, with actually quite a lot of level of local autonomy when you break it down to different provinces or cities. And also it has an uneven development of CCI between various regions. And also, so this kind of local context rendering them different from the British or Western counterparts. And several current studies criticize the impact of authoritarian control on cultural creation in China in so many different ways. And this is actually one of the literature, the book that you may want to take a look at if you're interested in it. And so actually we might say, and a lot of the current studies say, that why China is trying to promote the CCIs, that there are a lot of other policies that they're currently employing are against the further development of the CCI as more, naturally or it's burgeoning. And I think that it's for those of you who have been paying attention to the latest news in China in terms of entertainment world, that you definitely be able to relate to that, as many entertainers were scrutinized in terms of how they pay their tax, in terms of their personal life and so on. And yeah, that has definitely, I think, exemplified that we were saying here in terms of that authoritarian control sometimes can be against the cultural creation in the country. And now that we are going to take a look at how it gradually developed from before the 1980s to more recently. So what we can see is that before the 1980s, the central government controlled cultural production and promoted culture as a political and educational tool to secure the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and to pursue socialist civilization. So by which I think we would definitely think of the Cultural Revolution and how that at the time that entertainment and music and drama and theater were controlled and ensure that they abide with the communist thinking and then also the communist propaganda. But to be fair, that's something, it's dissimilar, but in the same time, in the same line with a lot of authoritarian regimes. And even that back in, the time that Taiwan was still under martial law, we still saw 净化歌曲, purifying songs and so on. So we could say that culture being controlled under authoritarian regime of various kind is really common. And so yeah, for China, it was like that too before the 1980s. But during the 1980s and 1990s, what we see is that the state began to recognize the economic value of cultural products and started to gradually allow private enterprises to conduct cultural production. However, that we are still able to see that the influence from the state, and actually to some extent is growing to be even stronger. Because we can see the state administration for radio, film, and television, and the state press and publication administration were established for the regulation and licensing of production of audiovisual and print media. So these agencies were established particularly for controlling the content and then also, regulating what is able to deliver to the audience or the consumers. And so indeed that it develops its own kind of like mechanism which allows control over private enterprises. So some of you might be quite familiar with this, which is the SARF's regulation over film and television programs. So you can see that there are guidances that which sometimes they are updated and sometimes they were changed and revised, but there have been quite a few, I think, guidelines that can be considered quite ambiguous and also difficult to follow. Such as that number 5, that it is like stories of, traveling back in time, if that's relevant to that. It has to be scientific and then it has to be positive. Then we also have seen the 13th guideline, which would be any like gay or LGBTQ stories that have to be, just not to be over the top, and then they have to be maintaining in like friendship, So there have been quite a few of this kind of guidelines, and sometimes it is actually netizens or people are trying to make a guess of what's the reason for being banned, but also that there are regulations or rules to follow for the producers, which makes it, I think, sometimes really hard because you don't really always know that when you are stepping over the line and when the line is ambiguous in itself. What we see is that in the 2000s that the state began to officially use the term cultural industries in policy documents, such as the 10th five-year plan for the development of national economy and society. So the term cultural industries have been officially used around this era, which is actually something quite similar to a lot of other places in the world. And as we said, that from Taiwan, it was from 1991, so a little bit earlier, and in Thailand, it will be the similar, decade. And also they promote a reform of the cultural system, 文化体系. So to promote 文化体系, the cultural system, that tons of pro-market policies interwoven with the socialist state, they were kind of like established. And we also see private enterprises flourish alongside the repressive law, which is, similar along the line that of what we mentioned in the previous slide. So with regards to local autonomy, scholars Kane and Zhao note that national cultural policies only play a guiding role, and much policy is deliberately vague and open to interpretations. So because of that we do see a lot of local practices that differ from one another, even though that the idea of having such as audiovisual products being, delivering positive messages that is scientific, that is realistic, might be the general role. But how tight the control can be and how much censorship can go into mechanism from the top would really differ from one place to another. And that is actually why that to take a look at the Chinese CCI, that we are actually taking an approach to look at different cities, so we have that comparative perspectives. So for different cities, not only have the terms creative industries, cultural and creative industries, and cultural industry been used unsystematically by various cities, but several cities also have their own definition and clarification of local cultural and creative industries. So I think we are coming to the point which has been made quite clear already, which is for the CCI development in China that local governments matter. Moreover, we see almost 90% of the public funding source supporting CCI comes from local finance rather than central government. It means that the local governments does not only have the right to interpret the law and the guidance from the central government, they also actually have the power to distribute funding and also to come up with schemes that they prefer. So local governments exclusively decide on the use of local public funding. Finally, different Chinese cities have failed to exert the same extent of censorship on cultural production. So let's have a look at the 3 cities, which are the 3 case studies that we're going to speak about today, and which are Beijing, Harbin, and Guangzhou. So let's have a look at the capital city, Beijing. The municipal government of Beijing has displayed an increasingly commercially and digitally oriented trend in supporting local CCI since 2006. And the use of public funding are in the following directions. Firstly, infrastructure for creative and cultural clusters. So this would be quite similar to what we mentioned as for Huashan and Songyan district. And secondly, that the public funding in Beijing were also used to support the products or projects that pass government censorship. So it means that, intellectual property rights and have reached at least 20% of their completion and so on. So, and also that we see Beijing itself as the political center. They also exerted more control on the entry of non-public capital than national regulations. The latter usually limited the investment of foreign capital to television and movie production in the form of joint capital, with the state holding more than 51% of the shares. So from here that you're able to see that even though that they welcome to some extent the foreign capital, but they still want a really, tight control over the final product. So that is why that the state would usually still insist to have more than, half of the share. And this is pretty common for most of a lot of the television services and production companies in China. And I would like to show you an example, actually, which is a showcase festival called Sound of the City, which I visited in 2018. We have shared something a little bit about showcase festivals from the case of South by Southwest, from the case of Sound City. So Sound of the City is the Beijing version of the showcase festival. But what is quite different is that most of the showcase festivals that when they run, that they received some level of the support from either the local or the central government, because that is seen as a good initiative to have the talents locally to play for the international delegates or guests. And also it's great to have international acts to play in the city, because it probably would, increase the number of people that come for tourism and so on. So it's generally seen as good for policymakers, for, urban development and for the branding of the city. But in China it's a bit different. So Sound of the City is run privately, and even though with some officials being quite friendly to the festival, but it's nothing really like other places. So I want to show you that my experience in a very short, rough edit of the video. So I went there in 2018, and then what happened was that the whole festival got cancelled halfway. It was supposed to last for like 4 days, but from day 3 and 4 that it was completely cancelled. And so basically that the team, the organizer, has to move some of the events because they still want people to be able to play for the delegates who fly from, various different countries. So they moved that to a private recording studio where, is allowed to have music played. But all the tickets have to be refunded for day 3 and 4. So it definitely caused a lot of damage, but it's by no means the first time Sound of the City has encountered that. So I think it's a good example to illustrate that kind of friction and tension that could exist in some of the sectors in CCIs in China. So I'll show you the clip and feel free to have a look at what happened that year in the festival. So next, I would like to show you another city, the case of Harbin. So as you know, Harbin is the city that in the northeast. It's very close to Russia, and then it's very cold. And you can see that the ice festival is in the picture. I've never had a chance to go, but if some of you have been, I really love to hear about your experience in there. So Harbin is a city that is largely based on, its industry is based on manufacturing and also mineral industries. So since 2005, Harbin started to pay increasing attention to local cultural development. In addition, that the city was among the first to follow a planned economy, but the last to shift to a market economy. So you can almost say that the industry itself that has a really, really strong socialist or even communist past in terms of its economy. So most of the industries were planned top down, and there is less kind of like incentive in the markets for the local industries to be stimulated. So the pre-existing ideas of planned economy, which focus on supporting public cultural institutions rather than market competition, thus had greater influence on Harbin even till today. So we see that from 2006 to 2008, the municipal government in Harbin used public funding in 3 main directions. And we can have a comparison between Harbin and Beijing after we share about this part. So firstly, that they used public funding to support products that embody Harbin's characteristics that are competitive in the cultural market. Secondly, the fund was used to cover the expenditure of public-owned cultural institutions, which include art performance troupes, and newspapers as well as broadcasting and television. And they also use it to upgrade equipment of printing and publishing enterprises and the maintenance of cinemas. Last but not least, that they used the public funding to subsidize for scientific and educational films, children's films, and academic works that are advocated by the municipal governments and the party. So we can see that all these 3 things, when you think about what Taiwanese governments are doing right now, a lot of them that we're still doing it. It's just that I think we have a mixture, a model which is a mixture of potentially what Beijing did and then also what Harbin did. So you can see a very strong kind of like public support into the type of art and institutions which are already been acknowledged with certain, cultural value. And that's what's quite different from Beijing, and then also from another city which we're going to talk about, which is Guangzhou. So let's have a look at Guangzhou here. So Guangzhou is the southern city that is the second tier, one of the first tier city in China. So as a city of the southern coast that moved first in promoting market economy, Guangzhou is more commercially and digitally oriented in the use of public funding than the other two cities, and continues to embrace non-public capital to support culture. So for Guangzhou, from 2007 to 2011, municipal policies focused particularly on the funding of animation and software industries to improve Guangzhou's competitiveness and to create further wealth. So I'm sure that you can think about Shenzhen, right? Because Shenzhen is located in Guangzhou, and also near Guangzhou, and then also the whole Guangdong province actually have this tendency to, promote software industries and then also the information technology further. So Guangzhou, that the commercial profit has been the key element of Guangzhou municipal policies in allocating public fundings, and culture has been treated as an economic resource, which is invested in order to gain greater commercial profits. Although Guangzhou's cultural production is also under authoritarian control by the municipal governments, their regulations are less strict than national regulations on cultural production. So here, on this table, that we're able to see the summary of amount of government funding of the three case studies about between 2006 to 2003. So we can see for Guangzhou that the amount of funding for culture actually increased from 10 million yuan to 60 million yuan. For Beijing, it sort of increased. Well, it sort of decreased after 2008, which is actually a very big year for Beijing, isn't it? To 500 million, and then from 2012, that it increased again to 900. But for Guangzhou, you can see that it's been 150 for 5 years, and then it decreased quite dramatically, right, to 30 from 2013 to 2015. So we can see that they are this kind of changes are triggered by different kind of reasons, and then they are changed due to the local kind of like regulations. It doesn't always go along with the 5-year plan, because the 5-year plan was to increase it. So which for all the cities, I think the one that stick to it the most might be Harbin. And why Beijing and Guangzhou, they sort of have their ups and downs, and then the reasons might be based in the more local context. And we're also able to see that on this figure, that the amount of government funding between 2006 and 2013, that, so we see that how that this change and how that it almost remains kind of like, gradually increasing on Harbin. So that was kind of like same amount of information as we had in the previous one, but you can see how that it actually changes a lot, especially for Beijing, that because originally it has the highest amount of public funding, why that also it sort of decreased and then increased again after 2012. So policymakers in Beijing are very much aware of the implications of creativity agenda for their own political regime. And they're also aware of the connections between creativity and democracy, just as openness to trade and cultural goods and services brought concerns with cultural security. This is frequently characterized as hypocritical instrumentalism. The Chinese government wants creativity effects, but without the dangerous consequences that come with it. The dangerous consequences here that it usually means the democratic consequences or the chance for the people to be kind of like longing for democratic systems because of these products. So this is actually a very difficult kind of like, well, and then also from, I think, our perspective would be kind of unpleasant balance to maintain. But that's something that we see pretty often in Chinese CCI policy making. Next, I would like to introduce you the case of Shanghai, which is a creative cluster that can serve as an example here in this talk. Creative cluster in Shanghai that what we see is from 改革开放 since the late 1970s, which means reform and opening, to 改革创新, which is reform and innovation that happens after the end of 1980s and 90s. So the Chinese word for creativity, 创意, arrived from Hong Kong, where the UK neologism was first translated, and it relates specifically to artists rather than technical innovation, 就是创新. And we see that there is this ambiguity between cultural and creative marked cluster policy, which in Shanghai was also divided into cultural versus creative, with the economic and propaganda or publicity departments overseeing their respective entities. So, for those of you who have been to Shanghai, you might have been to M50, which is the creative cluster that you can see on your right-hand side, that there are some photos of the buildings and then also the graffiti and then also the kind of like the infrastructures for exhibitions to take place. So the first group of artists moved into M50 in 1999. The artists we moved in used to be affiliated with public institutions, such as working as university lecturers or as salaried artists in professional associations, artists work group, 单位, artist 单位, or SOEs. So when they were pushed out of the state system during the privatization of the 1980s, that the financial necessity saw them seek out affordable working spaces and led them to empty factories. So SOEs stand for state-owned enterprises, that we might have covered some of it previously, but yeah, that's what the abbreviation is short for. And so you remember that how in 1997 the artists also voluntarily moved into Huashan Creative Park, right? So it seems like the similar actions been taken, but for various different reasons and very different like context and background. Because artists in China, that as you can see, that some of them work in a communist and socialist type of like mechanism, so that there are different kind of entities that they work in, such as salary artists and then also artist work groups that way. So but because of privatization, that there is kind of gradually out of job, and then they need to find a place for them to continue their career, which will be very different than the one I used to have, because it's a completely different kind of system. So they're drawn into a space in M50, as we know it now. So the initial policies in M50 would be focusing on the initial like low financial stakes involved in M50, which encouraged the artists to cluster and interact. It was particularly attractive to those who were just starting out. Those were many experimental art forms in M50, providing a fertile ground for new talent to get feedback from their peers. And in terms of the governance, that M50 is governed by Shanghai Textile Development Corporation, a state-owned enterprise. And then it had to convert other business activities as manufacturing declined and moved its operation to cheaper locations in the west or northwest of China. So M50 is located in Shanghai, and Shanghai's massive strategic investment in visual art is there, and parcel of similar investment in the cultural and creative industries with large is something that currently absent from most Western countries. So they have this very strategic goal and also source of funding, which is investment in particular in visual art, and which is prevalent even till today in M50. So for M50, that it had elements of that organic development associated with artist quarters or villages in the West, and it acted as a space of learning and exchange for artists and intermediaries, along with managers and policymakers who we can associate with the creative millennium. Also, we see the growing commercialization of M50, which resulting gentrification of adjacent areas. And it's also a process that's driven by local state agents and often well-connected artists, entrepreneurs. And so can we actually call it as an authoritarian state or a completely state-driven cultural policy anymore? Or is it more like an authoritarian state-driven neoliberalism because it's still, driven by the notion of commerce and entrepreneurial activities and so on, and also, development of properties and urban spaces, which led to gentrification. So what we can see is that a variant on the process of arts-led urban gentrification, which has its similarity with what happened in the West, which is in the capitalistic system. So last but not least, that we're going to have a bit of a reading, and then we would also move on to discussion. So the reading would be based on a particular piece about strategizing for creative industries in China, written by Anthony Feng in 2016. So it's quite a long piece of article, but I would like you to take 20 minutes to take a look at maybe just one part, maybe just beginning and the end, or maybe just one particular sectors that you're most interested in. And we'll come back to class and we will discover what you find and then also how do you find it. So I'm providing you a general picture of what this reading is about. So Anthony Feng analyzed different CCI sectors, and then he came to kind of like an argument that the creative industries in China have two dimensions. It has one dimension of global reliance, and it also has another dimension, which is the ideological control. And these two don't always sit together really well, but also that global reliance doesn't always stand for, kind of like promoting the liberation from that ideological control. Sometimes it actually have to abide with the other dimension so that it works. And so to some extent that the global capital doesn't always stand on the side of resolving or decreasing the ideological control. It also goes into some analysis on animation, music, film, and game sectors. And it also argues that global capital and nationalism in China might actually have some relationships in between, that it might even promote it. It actually also argues that there is a form of soft power, which is soft power without citizenship. It means that soft power in China has been growing, but it was grown also because of the international kind of like politics and dynamics in between, so that some of the countries were actually supporting that. And till today, that I think we're in a very different time now, that gradually, because of the China-US trade war to begin with, and then various, I think, diplomatic issues, so that the world seems to turn against China a bit more these days compared to 2016. And I also wonder that if that would change because of the global dynamic and the creative industries would develop in a different way. And from what we can see in Taiwan, it's quite obvious that some of the entertainers and then also probably creatives, they would prefer to just stay away from China after years and years of being there. So yeah, indeed, that we can see some of the results from this kind of dimensions. So I would argue that I think Anthony Fung was right in most of the parts of the article. But I also would definitely love to know what you think, and we would be having some discussions about the final assignment along with this article. So when you read it, you might only have the time to scan through it, which is completely fine. I really encourage you to take notes, and then please take note of the things that you think that you like and you identify with. And also do take note for the things that you kind of slightly question as well, so we can all have discussions about this kind of two things. And thanks for taking this class, and then I'm very honored to be able to have this time with you in the past weeks and in this semester. I hope you feel that it's fun, even though it's online, even though that we don't actually get to interact in person as much. But yeah, I really enjoy spending time with you in the learning, and then also in the discussion, and when we get to have it, even by text. I think it's great. And so let me know what you think after you come back and have a glimpse of the reading. I'll see you very soon.